not just us, is bringing people together for discussions and conversations. We advocate for students and their families of color, LGBTQIA, different faiths, incarcerated individuals, people who are Indian, Native Indians, people who are lower income. We want to work with everybody because we all have one thing we all are agreeing to, is that we all want diversity, inclusion. We want people's voices to be raised.
So this verse really kind of shows that God created us in diverse groups so we can recognize and learn from one another, not so we can oppress each other. And then God says the most honorable among you is not based on race or education or money. It's really based on your actions and your deeds. And of course, education goes in line with that, but it's your actions that set you apart in God's eyes.
Motto of our international community is love for all, hatred for none. And that's right in line with the spirit of this group that we're gathered here for. And this is not a motto that's just here in Connecticut or the United States. We actually are an international community. We have an international head, which is the Khalifa. And this principle of love for all, hatred for none is something that applies in our community in Europe, in South Asia, India, in Africa, here in the United States, and in all the chapters across the United States. The United States is a very diverse country. And we give that same message whether it's in California or in Texas, here in Connecticut, or any other part of the country. So this is a consistent aspect of our message, and this is a point that we try to spread and take everywhere. Now, one thing that the international head of our community has emphasized a lot when it comes to so much of the division that we see in the United States or in the world is that it really comes down to injustice. And the point that he has emphasized, and we carry that message forward also, is that justice is the most important thing. It's a principle that's taught to us in the Holy Quran, and it's something that we all agree on. And the reason why it's so important is because when we start treating people fairly in every facet of life, then we'll see that a lot of the hatred starts to go away. Because at the end of the day, people, they really just want to be treated fairly. But whatever party we interact with, whatever group we interact with, we take that same basic message that we should be fair, we should be just, we should not let our biases affect anything. And when we adhere to that principle, no matter what, then that's something that spreads love and it removes hatred.
I know it's easy for us all to listen to each other, and I think that we have a struggle when it comes to actually hearing what the other people around us are saying. Are we actually hearing what the other person's perspectives are? Are we hearing the fact? Are we open to the fact that we all have different lived realities and we all have different day-to-day experiences? One of the things that I learned by knocking on doors was how much we all share in common. And we really do have common goals. We want our families, we want ourselves, we want our loved ones to be healthy, we want them to be happy, and we want opportunities to make our lives better. The task is, how do we make that happen for people regardless of background? And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that many of us also share a lot of the same values when it comes to freedom and individual liberty and wanting there to be equal justice under the law. I think the willingness to be here demonstrates the fact that we have an openness in our hearts and we have the desire to be empathetic to one another's needs. And it's doing so without taking each other down that becomes important. Something that I think a lot of us are struggling with is the narratives of hate that are promoted around us. Narratives of hate, I find, are used, I don't find that personally, but we see are used to scare, to create fear amongst us, especially those among us who are not in a position of power. What I hope is that we can continue to have conversations like this to build more conversations about empathy, understanding, hearing one another, and that we find a place where we can have an open and honest dialogue about our different lived experiences, that we can build bridges and work towards a place where we can actually help everyone to thrive and not just certain people to thrive, but that we all get to a point where we're comfortable, where we can all thrive together. And that is my hope.
I'm offended by how many new ways there are for hate groups to reach us. We're in a time it's unprecedented where the internet is not just about spreading good things, but also straight lies. Now, my job as a tech person, if you see anything online, it's hard to figure out what's real and what's not, and that's an actual fact, and that's not by accident. The people who are doing these things know that young people are vulnerable. And when you're vulnerable, the first time you hear something might be when you're 13 or 14 or maybe even 10. Starts to change your mindset. People aren't born racist. They're not born against a race or against a religion or against a sex. They're taught by the people who are around them. I'm going to share two things. America can fix things, but America's like anywhere else. You have to identify the problem. There was a lot of money poured into colleges and universities pertaining to black institutions and black businesses. The people who are in office now are now lining up because of the Supreme Court last decision. They're saying that you can no longer fund black businesses to help to correct that issue. This is a fact. So black HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, they are having their money cut off from funders because they have found that it is discriminatory to give any type of consideration based upon race. So I'm saying we're in the midst of this. We can fix this. We have to be aware of this.
We believe that having more voices and more choices in the elections can only serve the public interest and perhaps reduce the polarity that has we've seen in recent years between the right and the left being very suspicious and attacking each other. We would like to see a more civil discussion of the elections based on the issues rather than personalities and party.
We think 60 to 70% of the people are unheard, unlistened to, and have no voice in our political system. We have two polarized extremes that drive the bus, and they don't care to listen to anybody else. They have no different plans, and we think many of them have very old, tired ideas. So we've come out with a new platform or aspirational goal for how to make Connecticut better for everyone, and focus on that.
One of the things that always struck me whenever we had conversations about social justice, very often time were being in a room where you felt as though people were afraid to speak up. They were afraid to share their personal views in their upbringing because of the fear of being attacked by the next person. And many often times when we've had conversations, it's very hard to talk about social justice and to talk about education and not talking about financial peace, because the reality is that when we talk about social justice, when we talk about education, financial security plays a huge role, right? So very often, being someone who is an immigrant in this country, who came as a refugee, I see a lot in a lot of the communities where you may have someone who goes to work and they are afraid to speak up and advocate for themselves. And this is something that I've experienced. This is something that family members have experienced. So a lot of times we have this conversation about social justice. For me, one of the things I've been thinking about is, man, like, how do we start teaching families, parents, youth to live more than just for the tomorrow? And that comes a lot with being able to educate people. And one of the things that I was asked to speak on is about how financial competence is important in diversity. Well, it's hard, again, to speak up. It's hard to root for issues if you do not have the money to back it up. It's hard to root for issues when you feel like if I speak up at work, I could lose my job. If I speak up at work, I don't have the savings to be okay. I am afraid to even retire, and now I have to work until I'm 80 plus years old because I don't have the money. So when we talk about social justice and education, for me, it really comes about how do we start having more conversation about financial power. And that is something that I think as a society we should have more conversations about.
The problem that we address is that our government, despite all the promises and all the myths of American exceptionalism and greatness and all the promises that we make to citizens, American government has failed to implement many of those constitutional safeguards for average Americans. We touched on this. Various members of the panel have already addressed this. And as a result, innocent Americans are inflicted with great harm. We are focusing on, particularly on the criminal justice system and the piece of it that harms wrongfully accused innocent Americans. We here have in mind creating a nonprofit. We are creating, in the process of creating a nonprofit that addresses the pretrial phase where people haven't been convicted yet. Much larger in numbers, and in some ways equally important because the devastation that the system wreaks upon people is forever. We've launched as our flagship campaign what we call COACH, Coalition to End the Chokehold. The chokehold being this array of tactics, which I have here on a flyer I can hand out to you all, make available to anybody that's online through our website. We've identified 16 points of chokeholding, if you will, that the system puts on the accused. Guilt by accusation, overcharging, excessive bail, police and prosecutor misconduct, media manipulation. Don't believe that much of what you read in the media about those who've been criminally charged, unless it's sort of somebody who's cut and dried and is, even if they've admitted to a crime, it might mean that they've been coerced into admitting to a crime if they're somehow challenged or young or being deprived of their legal representation. Family separation, loss of employment, loss of home, pretrial restrictions of other sorts. There's a whole variety.
It's just really sad to see like the whole country's really feels like it's taking a step back in all kinds of aspects, whether it comes down to environmental issues, where it comes down to LGBTQ plus immigrants and all of that. It just seems like everything is just kind of, I feel like we made a lot of progression and then this is like a big recession of that. A lot of people ask if pride organizations and LGBTQ plus organizations are really necessary in a state like Connecticut. Like we've discussed already, is that Connecticut's a very Democrat-heavy state. It's very it at least has the appearance of a very liberal place, but it's not all the time. Not for everybody. Whether you're a person of color or you're in the LGBTQ plus community, it can be tough for a lot of people. I think that, even with the climate of the country the way it is, and I think it's important that we have brave people standing up and protecting people that are in weaker, vulnerable positions. And I think it's important that we make affirming spaces, safe spaces for all of us. I think a lot of things that confuse people is the between gender and sex, like the identity. Research. It's not hard to understand and figure out. It's just like Googling something. If you don't know what someone who's intersex is, Google it. Understand what they're talking about if you're not sure. Or ask the person, but ask them in a respectful way. There's a right way and a wrong way to ask somebody a question, and I think that is the best way to approach it sometimes. At the end of the day, I think the whole point of what we do is we're just trying to make safe places for queer people to be. And one of the worst things that I think bothers me is when someone tries to say that we're indoctrinating children. We don't want to turn your straight kids gay. We want to keep your queer kids alive. And that's all we're trying to do, and I think everybody should try to find themselves a pride organization and get involved and do all that stuff.
So many things that each of you have said, and I'm like, you know what? That's why I do what I do, is to connect. So I do a thing with one of my many groups called Story Circle. And we get together it's a nonpartisan thing. We get together, and it's actually a technique from the civil rights movement in the 60s. One-on-one conversations, power mapping, cutting out issues, community organizing techniques. And one of them that's so beautiful is a story circle, where you get together with people who you may think you have nothing in common with. And it's a great equalizer. You could be sitting next to the mayor of Meriden,
Yep.
and some next to another person who's unhoused and sleeping under a tree tonight.
Hmm.
So, but connecting is what I like to be.
One person does matter, you know, because one person getting up and doing what they do for their community, and now it's all coming together and being uniting and being aware of other people. We have more in common than we have against. And you and I, sir, have discussed this many times. We want to end silos across the state. That's what our organization tries to do, is to bring people who would not normally be in conversation with each other to the events, to the on-calls, to work with the legislation. Because one person does have a powerful voice, and that person should be you.